Welcome to the Woven Energy Podcast on real practical shamanism with me, Joseph Sikora, and as always, Damon Smith. We are here to talk about shamanism from the ground up. So, this one is going to be hopefully a really fun and interesting one. There's an article that's been released on the Metro, which is basically titled "Thousands Converting to Shamanism Across England and Wales, Census Reveals." And this article has many a gem to pick from it. So my plan is to kind of go through this article with Damon and hopefully give our spin on it and chat through the various points that it puts across. But essentially what it's saying is, from in last year's census, 2021, there has been a massive tenfold increase in those identifying as shamans. So that's the kind of broad brushstroke overview. So, Damon, how are you doing, man?
I'm good, mate. A couple of points to make on that. One is that I think the tenfold increase is over something like a 10-year period. It's not instantaneous since 2021.
So 2011
pretty much the
to
period that this
2021,
podcast has been running, almost. But
it's all down to us, Damon, of course.
I don't think so. But anyway, maybe there's a possibility. The other thing to say is this: it was Graham that found this article. Shout out to Graham.
Yeah.
We definitely will be covering this because this is right up the heretic street. This article, we will be covering the slightly. Probably the negative sides of this article on heretics. Maybe we may do more than one episode on it. But today, I think we're just going to cover the shamanistic aspect on the Woven Energy podcast. And
the points which it goes into about what shamanism is, which are fascinating.
Yeah.
So,
and we'll leave me and Graham over on the other channel to delve into the what constitutes shamanism in the UK today.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's a particular passage in it which I think could be very interesting either for here or heretics. But what now? Yeah, we'll get to it. Yeah. We can have a chat about it. But I guess the first thing to ask you, Damon, really is in the broad overview, in the broad overview sense. Why do you think, in general, there is an increase of people, quote unquote, identifying as shamans?
I think there's a lot of reasons. I think that one of the things that's driving it are, I guess, people like myself who were involved in the archaic revival, the so-called archaic revival in the 1990s. Here we are 20 years later. And
that's the whole Terence McKenna thing, right?
Well, not just Terence McKenna. We had the whole bands like the Shaman, and there was a lot of stuff in popular culture that was hinted towards something like an archaic revival in general. The general premise being that back then that our ancestors, our remote ancestors, and contemporary peoples who have more shamanic lifestyles in the world today, vanishingly small numbers of them, that we lost something when civilization came along 5,000 to 10,000 years ago. In some areas of the world, like the UK, it's much more recent than that, but in parts of the world, 5,000 to 10,000 years ago, civilization arose. We gained something, but we also lost something. The issues that happened in the 90s archaic revival were ones of shallowness. Though the people who in contemporary world still practice shamanism, and those much larger number of people, larger number of groups going back millennia who practice shamanism for 2 million plus years, depending on how far you go back. That shamanism is a very rich and deep shamanism. And I would suggest that the shamanism of the 90s, the archaic revival that went on in the 1990s, was the sort of opposite of that. It was very broad. Anything vaguely spiritual could have been classed as something vaguely shamanism. But it was incredibly shallow. There were quite a lot of people around that time who were, quote unquote, into it. But if you'd ask them to explain it to you or demonstrate something to you, they definitely would have had trouble. They definitely did have trouble.
They would show you their various. They'd show you their various animal costumes,
and it was also heavily linked to rave culture. Not that there's anything wrong with rave culture. I love rave culture. Scooter, for instance, is one of my favorite bands. But I think that a lot of the people who were young then, not saying I was young, I was younger than I am now, maybe the subsequent time has disassociated partially the shallowness aspect. Or to put it a different way, maybe people who were involved in that back then now feel differently about it and would like to, I mean, they've had the benefit of 20 years of experience, would like to understand shamanism properly. And the main focuses of, the culture of that time, he's a good, I'm Ebenezer good, or he's Ebenezer good. Those sort of focuses are not present or not as powerful as they are now. And again, I don't want people to think I'm slagging down the Shaman, because they're also one of my favorite bands. And they did that amazing thing with Terence McKenna and all that stuff, So
it's interesting you mention raves, because raves, I've never been to, it's totally not my thing. But as far as I'm aware, raves are very much about putting yourself into a bit of an ecstatic kind of trance, and just trancing the night away. So
raves are shamanic to a point.
Yeah.
But the thing that's
it's
missing,
natural to think that people that would go to raves would naturally think, okay, that it's not a big leap to go from that to something like shamanism, which is.
It's not, but for some people it may be a 20-year leap. And I think a lot of the people who are getting into shamanism, I mean, the real reason that I believe that most people get into shamanism, irrespective of when it is this kind of life realization around the social promise, the unspoken social promise of our collective societies. The promise being, you're born, you go to school, you work hard, you get qualifications, you use those qualifications to get into a job, you work for 40, 50 years through the different levels of your job, you get a senior management position at some point in time, you're on a good salary, you've got a good pension, and then you retire, and however many years you've got left, you then spend those doing what you want. And along the way...
It's like the ultimate carrot dangling from the stick, isn't it?
Yeah, and along the way...
you never quite reach it.
You cheer... Well, it's not just that. Along the way, you cheer yourself up, because working in hierarchical command and control structures, to a greater or lesser extent, is not a natural state. It's not in our genes. It may be in our culture, but it's not in our genes. Because we lived in small hunter-gatherer groups for so long, millions of years, and we've done this command and control thing for at absolute maximum in some very remote parts of the world, remote from us in the UK anyway, 9,000 years maybe at the maximum. 9,000 years of command and control. Yes, boss, daffy cap to the gaffer. A little bit of wealth is parceled out to me every now and again as long as I do what I'm told. On the one hand, 9,000 years of that versus 2+ million years of living in the garden, as the Bible, Genesis, relates it. Shout out to Heretics listeners. And if anybody is into shamanism, fancies listening to the Heretics podcast, we got some great episodes on Genesis on there, the early part of Genesis, which will go into that a bit.
The Garden of Eden, you mean? The
real meaning behind the Garden of Eden to me is that living off the land in a small group who are mutually supportive. There are hierarchies in that group, but they tend to be ability hierarchies. When it comes to the subject of hunting, people will turn to the best hunter for advice. It's a no-brainer. That's very, very different.
Competence hierarchies.
Yeah, that's meritocracies, if you like. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's a very small group. There aren't enough people in the group to have 21 levels of management, as I experienced in a particular UK government department, won't name it. 21 levels of management in a group of less than
and
21 people.
Pay scales. These 21 managements have those different minute pay scales, and you just go up that little pay scale, and it's hardly enough to slip away from between them. But yet you're just like, you're happy, aren't you? You got your little badge and you got your little pay packet. Yeah.
What I was going to say was that along the way, this is where the materialism comes into it. Along the way, you're supposed to cheer yourself up by buying yourself things or making other people happy by buying them things. That's the cheery bit of it. You know, you buy yourself a pair of new shoes or something like that, you know, and that cheers you up along the way or along your journey. A lot of people, if they don't have something else in their lives, incidentally, something I've observed, they get to retirement, and if all they've had is their jobs, and they were probably the ones who were the most senior, if all they've had in their jobs is their jobs in their lives, as soon as they retire, they have nothing in their lives. I recommend to any of those people listening, I recommend you take up Tai Chi or something as quickly as you can. Because I have noticed that quite a lot of people, not everyone, but quite a lot of people go downhill when they retire quite quickly. And I think part of that is they've actually got nothing to do but sit and watch TV, which pumps yet more of the same kind of miasma into their brains, into their consciousness, into their sense of self. But that's all around, especially the marketing and the politics and all that kind of stuff. That's all around perpetuating the model that they've just left. They've just been working for the elites within society for 40 years. And the stuff that's in the media and everything is telling them how they should go about supporting those elites in their positions constantly. But now they've just been kicked out the end of it and they're retired. But there's nothing on the TV but stuff that is relevant to them back when they were in that, in that miasma.
Yeah.
So I think that's one of the reasons why people get into it in general. But what I'm thinking with this growth over the last 10 years, there's a lot more good information about shamanism out there on the internet. Obviously, the internet also has something to do with it, because you remember back in the 90s, the early 90s, internet wasn't really a thing, where it's almost everything now, isn't it? If it's not on the internet, it's not real, I think, to my kids' generation. It's a
whole, I think of the universe as a whole other world, a universe that's just been
the internet,
kind of built.
Yeah. So my kids' generation, it's almost like, I don't care if it's an Encyclopedia Britannica, I want to know what Wikipedia says about it, that kind of thing, it's that kind of thing. Yeah. So, which in some ways is positive, because I think people were certainly in our religious culture for the last 2,000 years in the West, we have had a thing baked into the culture where if it's in a book, it has a higher level of credibility than if it's not in a book. Now, I spent a long time working in the publishing industry. I know that is not a criterion that anybody wants to apply to anything, in terms of the veracity of a piece of information. The fact that it's in a book. Somebody said that every individually different book that's published in the world in modern times, because the rate of publishing accelerates all the time. If you were to lay the books as they're published, one copy of each different book that's published in the world, end to end at the point when it's published, and you laid them out end to end, you wouldn't be able to run fast enough to keep up with the end of that line, let alone read those books. You couldn't actually run fast enough to keep up with the end of the line of the books being created. Like an ever-increasing library that stretches away into the distance. And you're trying to run to keep up as the library grows, but the end of the library is running away ahead of you. That's the rate at which new books are being published in the world today. And there is no way that those books have rigorous, awesome, high-quality information in them being published in that way. It's just not, it's not a thing.
Not all of them, but you kind of like, hopefully you develop a sense of what really works for you and the kind of information in those books that you feel like you could bring on board and learn from.
The few. Yeah, that's a tough thing. And another thing is all books are to do with the baseline. And the fundamental problem, as we've discussed with our culture, is that people overemphasize the baseline in our culture. And so, not that I'm saying anything wrong with books. I've been involved around books all my life. I've had involvement with both reading various other things around books all my life. But there's something missing from all books, without exception, except maybe the book M. as the Rosicrucians call it, the Book of the World. The Book of the World isn't a book, for those that don't know. So look, I recommend the Heretics podcast if you're interested in the Rosicrucians as well. The book is forget human-produced books. Let's look at the world itself. Let's look at nature. Let's look at how the world operates in a direct and participative and immediate way, and use that as a rigorously, not rigorously researched, but rigorously accurate source of information, because all books are about that. So why not look at that, cut out the middleman, so to speak? That's still a baseline approach. It's just a kind of better baseline approach. And it's sort of the ideas behind science, when the underground stream back in the Renaissance turned into science, then that was the thinking behind that. But it's still baseline, And the fundamental problem that the archaic revival in the 90s sought and possibly slightly failed to address is the other two. It's the physical and it's the spiritual. That no matter how many books you read, it won't resolve the issue that we have with that. So this is why we're always on this podcast, we're always asking people to go out and practice. And now we're doing that on Heretics as well with our alchemy tutorials. Actually go out and practice and do shamanism stuff, not just read about it. Mm. There's a great koan, Zen story that I think is relevant to this, to do with how we as a society view books and the written word. It goes like this. The Zen priest comes down into the garden in the morning, the temple garden, and there's an acolyte, a young monk, kneeling and meditating in the garden very early in the morning. And the monk goes over to the young man and says, "Why are you meditating at this time of the morning?" And the young man looked at him with a puzzled look on his face, and he said, "Well, I'm trying to come in touch with my Buddha nature master." The monk said, "Oh," and he went off. The next morning, the young man comes down into the temple garden very early to do his meditation, and the master is already there. And the master's sitting on the edge of a rock, and he's got a brick in his hand, and he's got a cloth, and he's polishing this brick. And the man goes over to the master, and he said, "Master, why are you polishing a brick?" And the master says to him, "I'm making a mirror." The young man thought for a moment, and he said, "Surely no amount of polishing a brick will make a mirror." And the master said back to him, "And no amount of meditation will turn you into a Buddha." And I think this is a key kind of lesson about life. We, civilized human beings at least, we latch onto things like they are the thing. Mm. And perhaps, just perhaps, not everybody, but perhaps over the last 10 years or so, the cracks in our society, I'm not saying there aren't good things about our society, but the negative aspects of our society, and I mean our global society, are becoming more apparent to people just because a lot of these things are not self-sustaining. People are becoming overwhelmed with command and control, what Terence McKenna called dominator culture. People are becoming overwhelmed with it. And the people who are perpetrating it, the ruling elites, are becoming less and less subtle about how they go about doing that. And I think people are just getting sick of that. And then they start to look for something else. What's different from organized religion? What's different from the media culture? What's different from what used to be the TV industrial complex? What's different from this idea that life, in terms of how we live our lives, is a choice between different governance models? What's different from all of that? And when you start looking into this, there is really only one thing that's different, really different from all of that. And you end up in this place where this crazy subject of shamanism, much maligned, in every form of media there is, and in some cases rightly so, because of the whole shallowness thing. But there is some decent information out there which is accessible to people, which there wasn't. I mean, to those people, to the people who've got to the point in their lives where they've realized there's something more than being born, going to school, going to college, going to work, working hard, getting married, having a car and a nice house in the country with a white picket fence, then retiring, going on the golf course, and then dying.
I think it would be really...
there's something more to life than that.
Yeah. I think it would be really interesting to see the curve of how many people identify as shamanism from 2011 to 2021. Because I'm thinking, in 2020, obviously COVID hit, and one angle that you could do, I'm not necessarily saying this is my angle, but quote unquote, the powers that be forced everybody into their homes, locked the doors, not allow anybody out. Alone with themselves, their families, the TV, everything else to keep them entertained, basically just like being penned in. So it'd be interesting to see if...
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean,
if a sharp increase happened in 2020 and 2021.
Tiredness is something that keeps people under control. The old system of forcing you to go into work, often in places like I used to work in London, often in places where you're spending hours and hours of commuting in and hours commuting out, and just the general lifestyle that you had to live, this sort of quick, rapid lifestyle, in order to work as a, pawn in that system, that lifestyle made people very tired. And because they were so tired when they got home from work, all they want to do is like collapse in front of the TV, which drones that culture into their heads.
And eat certain foods that aren't necessarily the healthiest or the best foods for the brain and stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
The high sugar, high fat kind of.
Oh, yeah, that whole sucrose thing as well. So I think that the lockdown certainly gave opportunities for people to be a bit less tired. And therefore maybe to feel more like they could look into some other, let's not call them aspects of life, some other foundations of life.
Absolutely. Well, you see a lot of people take up health and fitness. I saw a massive spike in sales for my piano thing because everybody's locked inside and everybody's going, well, what can I do with my time now? How can I pursue perhaps the things that I'm interested in? So I saw a massive increase in sales just for that small period, and then it tailed back to normal. But there was a massive spike in my YouTube views as well. But you see it in the explosion in the fitness industry as well, with certain channels just exploding on the scene and taking advantage. Well, quote unquote, taking advantage. Maybe it's not taking advantage, but all of these people penned in, going, what else is life about? I've been in this kind of what you keep talking about what I said one time, this dir state. Everyone's in this dir state, going to work and back all the time. And now all of a sudden I've got time on my hands. I can't leave my house. My brain, I want to do other things. I want to stretch my wings a bit. What can I do?
Yeah. And here's
shamanism might fall into that,
Here's this wonderfully different thing that's so different from anything else I've experienced in my life. This is how I felt in the 1980s, But sort of 1985 onwards, I found shamanism. Here's this amazing, different, smoky, deep, broad, biggest subject I've ever encountered in my entire life, by far. And I know nothing about it. This is talking about me in like 1985. I know absolutely nothing about this. And so, hey, wow, that was my kind of draw into it. And I think shamanism, as long as people come to it with an empty cup or something approaching an empty cup, will pull people in, because shamanism has one big thing on its side. It has a couple of really big negatives in terms of people becoming involved or practicing shamanism, becoming shamans, if you like. The negatives are our culture is so down on shamanism, it's not real, and has been for thousands of years. We're talking burning at the stake and things like that. But also there are much more subtle things like, shamans are just a bunch of druggies. that type of thing. We don't want anything to do with them. They're freaky weirdos. Well, actually, the freaky weirdo thing is sort of true. I wear that as a badge of honor. That's what social teen's all about. But they don't understand it. They think it makes you...
The whole image of it doesn't help.
Yeah.
Take drugs, bang a drum, dance around in a circle, and now all of a sudden you have this mystical access to another world that, quote unquote, doesn't exist. It's all this kind of... the image that it portrays.
Exactly.
And isn't particularly great for real shamanism, but it can attract a certain type of person, right?
Yeah, and there's another aspect, which is the alternative medicine treatments community, which is both good and bad. There's some genuine shamans have done that kind of thing.
We need to talk about medicine on this podcast,
but
we've had a few requests for that.
Yeah,
so
we can do it. But
to
me, the link between medicine and shamanism is a heretic subject. It's not a woven energy subject, but it's a conflation. Sure, shamans have been experimental. They like to help their communities, and so inevitably they end up figuring out how to use plants and things like that in order to help people who are ill. That's inevitable. But the downside is there's a whole treatment bandwagon community out there that their sales model is come to me, to my clinic for a treatment, and then you pay transactionally for that, and then you go away and you come back for another treatment. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that model in terms of medicine and health and all that kind of thing. What I'm saying is that model has got nothing to do with shamanism, absolutely nothing. And the two things have been conflated, so that's a part of the confusion. But there's also this deeper thing, is that the whole TV industrial complex now, internet culture, all that kind of stuff, education systems, governmental systems, politics, all that kind of stuff, they all kind of, for want of a better word, brainwash us into a certain state, a certain place, a certain state that is partly identified as self. We talked before about, I'm not the kind of person who, a shaman should never say that. Or a good shaman should never say, I'm not the kind of person who, or if they do, they should identify the thing and then go and have a go at it. Because it implies there's a built-in inflexibility as part of who I am. And therefore I'm defining who I am in terms of my likes and dislikes. That is not a good way. That's a great way for advertising agencies, for you to define yourself in terms of your likes and dislikes. That's awesome for marketing agencies and advertising agencies. It's really bad for you as a human being. That's not how you should define yourself. And so this identification of self as having, gradually we're encouraged to create a view of self as we go through our education system. I won't go over all those things, all the miasmatic influences in our lives. A view of self that isn't who we really are, but we believe individually that is who we are. We know ourselves. We've always been encouraged to know ourselves, right? Yeah, right enough. So the issue is that to approach shamanism properly, you need an empty cup. And that whole knowing yourself thing is having a full cup and increasingly filling your cup as you go through your life. The best way to approach shamanism is, I made an awful lot of mistakes in the 1980s when I first kicked off with my shamanic study, for want of a better word. But the biggest mistake was my identity, who I thought I was. That was the biggest mistake. That was what was in my cup. And I think, to be honest, I wasn't too bad on that compared to possibly other people around me. I wasn't too bad on that because I really massively defined myself by the age of 18, So, because I had other things to worry about in life. But so those things are all blockers. Those things, it's our minds, it's our self-view, our self-belief, our buying into, our implicit buying into, for instance, in the UK. Are you a Labour voter? Are you a Conservative voter? Or are you a Lib Dem? Yeah. What? That's a shaman's question. What on earth? I was stopped.
Well, it's this lack of. It's this people want to have an identity, and so putting yourself into a box can give yourself an identity. But shamanism is about getting rid of that identity, isn't it? It's about...
Well, the first stage of shamanism is that the remaining 6 are beyond that point. Yeah. You can't get anywhere with shamanism until you have at least developed the ability temporarily to achieve that jealousy, to make yourself an empty cup. Or that's the foundation of all shamanic technique. But it's not the be-all and end-all. But anyway, that's all the negatives. That's not all of them. There's more. That's the sort of thing stopping people getting into shamanism.
Mm.
But there's one positive that I really want to highlight here. There is one positive. There's something that's going to suck you into shamanism like it sucked me in. And what is that? That's the DNA in every cell in your body. Because whatever that culture is, however strong it is, however strong the brainwashing is, it cannot fight against millions of years of evolution. That's the truth. The DNA in every cell in your body is on shamanism's side. Everything else isn't, but that is. That was my point. And so what we need to do is allow people to behave in ways, or increasingly behave in ways, that are more conducive to the way that their genes are.
Mm.
That's all. And it seems
Brilliant.
like, according to this census, it may be working. Because, we all know, everybody listening to this podcast knows, unless you're a new listener, in which case you should be all the way back to episode 1. But everybody listening to this podcast knows that those thousands of people who are coming and joining shamanism, a lot of those people still need some help in terms of what is shamanism. They still need some help with that, but maybe we can help them a bit. That's kind of our purpose in life, right?
But in a way that we try to lay out ways in which they can go out and learn for themselves, rather than shamanism is this, shamanism is that. I mean, with a bit of that in terms of the overview of shamanism, but in terms of what is shamanic technique, how to do it,
that's
it's more
what was
about,
missing in the 90s.
Here's the things that you can try, go out and do it.
That's what was missing big time in the 90s. I mean, there were a few people who did, myself included, But to be honest, I wouldn't have done. I'd probably just read about it all the time and dressed up in funny clothes. If I hadn't had some outside influence from other people, other shamans, if you like. That probably would have happened to me as well. That was the problem with the shallow archaic revival in the 90s that I loved. Let's not repeat that. What I'm saying is, in the late, what do we call these? The late nought. So that's the second decade of the. We're on 2022 now, aren't we? So this other thing, just off the record, or back in the day, people used to say the 90s and the 80s and the 70s and the 60s. What do we say these days to identify different decades? I guess 2000 to 2009 was the noughties, but what are we in now? Are we in the 20s again?
Actually, none of us really use the term 20s.
I think that's useful. I think that's useful to the miasma, because what they're trying to do, a lot of people they're trying to create, certainly for Western culture, they're trying to create an unchanging model. There's very, very little innovation in popular music, for instance, compared to what there was in the 70s, where people, hand building their own synthesizers with soldering irons and stuff. And then getting to the top of the charts, it's like that kind of innovation seems to be less. There seem to be. I mean, I have no problem identifying, even if I've never heard the song, I can say, oh, that's a piece of 80s music, that's a piece of 70s music. I can usually guess that kind of thing, even into the 90s, with Ebenezer Goode and stuff. That I can get into the 90s, but then telling the difference between the noughties and the 2010s it seems to get a bit harder. So. One of the things that I think is important is that they, Joe, I'm going to have to switch over. I don't know what I finished saying, but anyway, I think I'd finished whatever it was.
Well, I was going to say, it's like, this whole putting people in a box kind of thing again, because we're talking about the decades and looking back on the decades.
Yeah.
But people are trying to do that nowadays as well, with things like millennials, Gen Z, Gen X, boomers, and putting people's age brackets into boxes as well, as if that kind of, and then attribute a bunch of qualities to that kind of age bracket, sometimes in detrimental ways. But It's interesting, isn't it? How it's a natural thing to just want to compartmentalize everything and put everything in boxes.
Indeed.
And make sense of the world in that way.
Indeed.
Which is essential in some ways, but not necessarily the best thing in other ways, right?
Well, the point, all I was trying to do was identify different time periods. It seems to be difficult. I don't have the vocabulary anymore. So let's from now on, when we're referring to time periods, let's call 2000 to 2009, that's the noughties. And then 2010s, and now we're in the 20s, like the roaring 20s. Or was it the roaring 30s? I can't remember. The roaring 20s. Yeah, so we're back in the 20s again, which is cool.
Let's have a look at this article then. So there's so many things to mine from this article that would be so great to get your take on.
Go for it.
So I'm going to leave a link to the article in the information box for this podcast. So if you look down at your information, you'll be able to access it, or you can just type Metro Shamanism and it'll come up on Google. So it starts off by talking about the census and stuff, and then we get shamanism is a loose connection of beliefs found in various communities around the world, which revolves around healing practices.
Yes, well, that's wrong, isn't it? Do you know at the bottom of this article? At the bottom of the article, there's somewhere it says, here you go, do you identify as a shaman? We'd love to speak to you about it. Get in touch with webnews@metro.co.uk.
Do anybody you identify as a shaman?
Anybody fancy sending them an email, setting them right? Feel free.
So why is that wrong? Shamanism is a loose connection of beliefs found in various communities around the world, which revolves around healing practices.
Well, certainly it is a loose collection of beliefs. That's true. The revolves around healing practices. It does not revolve around healing practices. Shamanism revolves around the needs of communities, one of which is healing. But the major service, if you like, that the shamans throughout the millennia have provided to communities is strategic, what you might define as strategic servant leadership. That's giving advice about big picture aspects of life that have to do with nature. For instance, where should we go? Shaman knows where the animals are migrating. Yeah. So the hunters listen to the shaman, who's the guy or lady who's closest to nature. Shaman has a good idea where the animals are migrating. He has a good idea about current situation in the world. He's probably going to have a good idea about where some good hunting is to be found, for instance. That's the kind of strategic leadership that shamans provided to servant leadership, because remember that the shaman was not, at least to begin with, the boss, quote unquote, or the king, or the lord, or the chief of the group. They were simply like an advisor, like a guide. That's the core essence of the role of a shaman. But shamans are very experimental. They need to be in order to perform that core role. They need to be close to nature. They need to be constantly experimenting. Another one is there a better way to be doing our hunting? This is where the shamans and their tool making and our long descent into civilization started. The ability to experiment and make with new tools, that's all about how do we do hunting better once we actually get to this place that you've sent us to go. The shaman figures out how to make spear throwers and all that kind of stuff, and slings and bows and arrows and all that kind of stuff. And ultimately, in some ways fortunately, but in some ways unfortunately for shamanism, how to do agriculture as well. All of that stuff, it's the shaman's torsionality in their personality that makes them come up with stuff like that. That's the core role of the shaman within the group. Now, sure, people get ill, they injure themselves. People are going to turn to the shaman if nobody else is there that's going to specialize in dealing with that kind of thing. And in a lot of these hunter-gatherer groups, incidentally, virtually everybody would know how to deal, just as part of their culture, with things like that. There is a lot of archaeological evidence that people with very serious injuries survived into advanced ages, long after they had the very serious injury. Those groups were and are, if you look at people like the Sand people, they were and are very, very good at looking after each other. They all have, if you like, first aid skills. every single member of that group knows this stuff. It's not enough to define somebody as a shaman. And it's entirely possible, probably didn't happen at maybe it did happen somewhere, to be a shaman and not have good first aid skills. That's entirely possible. So the thing I think that's coming through in this article is that the alternative health community, now again, I'm not criticizing them, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. What I'm saying is they have latched onto shamanism as one of many avenues to promote their transactional services. And I think this is the fact that that model is in there is a slightly distracting thing for what shamanism is really about. And I think this is what the whoever's written it, Sean, hi Sean, if you're listening, Sean Seddon, the guy that wrote the article, I think this is what he's latched onto. And I would suggest that there's probably as many people in that part of the quote-unquote shamanic community in the UK as there are in the other one. So having said that, we do get thousands of listeners on this podcast. We do. And it says it's in the UK, it's increased by thousands. Well, probably the UK is our second biggest group of listeners after the US on this podcast. I would venture to think that we possibly get thousands of UK listeners on this podcast. So who knows? Maybe we had a little bit to do with it, Joe. I don't know.
Well, it's like I think both will have helped each other in some small way.
Yeah. Another thing that it says in the article, incidentally, that I thought was slightly sad is that there's more shamans than Rastafarians in the UK. Rastafarianism is one of the coolest exoteric religions on the planet. Yeah. If I had to become an exotericist and I was picking an exoteric religion to believe in, Rastafarianism would be right up there, right up on the top of my list. So yeah, anyway. And I'm also, incidentally, in terms of the music thing, I'm also I think one of the very few people on the planet who prefers Snoop Lion to Snoop Dogg.
Okay. Well, I do like me a bit of Snoop Dogg, though. It's just still hilarious.
In my opinion, his least popular album is his best album. For me, it's his best album.
Yeah.
But again, they didn't like it. He identified himself in one way to the miasma, to the community, and then he tried to change his identity. And commercially, it was a really bad idea for him. But for his credibility, I think he should have stuck with it personally. I'm sure he can afford to not be popular anymore if he really wants to. So Snoop Dogg, if you're listening, I think it's unlikely. Then, can we have Snoop Lion's second album, please?
So these three paragraphs I'm going to read you are pretty much at the same, harken at the same thing. So I'm going to read them out and then, of course, get your opinion on it. So adherents to shamanism hold that it's possible to communicate with the spirit world in order to bring about positive change through various esoteric methods involving ceremonies and trances. According to Earth Heart Shamanism, a UK-based group, its methods mean the spiritual world and your higher self may be contacted through the inner senses in ecstatic trance. It describes shamans as the keepers of ancient techniques that are used to maintain energetic synergy and balance within themselves and their communities. So there's there's bits and pieces in there, right?
I mean, I'll make a request. I mean, there's a lot of words used in there, and I'd like to delve into them on the Heretics podcast, to be honest, because
you could talk for hours.
The issue is, with all of those words that are being used, it's not, in some interpretations of those words, what the article's saying is not wrong, in some interpretations.
Yeah.
But you know that the interpretations that Sean, hi Sean, we love you, mate, we haven't met yet, but we'd like to, is using, you know that he doesn't have a good understanding of what any of these terms really mean in terms of shamanism. And there are alternative interpretations that are probably much closer to the surface of the article that are just plain wrong. That's probably the best way to put it. So can we just leave some of those off for heretics? Sure. Is that right? I wouldn't mind. And we will, I promise, me and Graham will go into that stuff in some detail on heretics. But
Well,
it's
here's
just
one
like,
for you,
it's like,
'cause
where
we
do
talk
you
about-
start?
Yeah, well, let's just start with one here, which is that,
Yes,
that
go
word ecstatic trance, because
Yeah,
that's
I know.
used so many times in shamanism
Yeah.
that it would be good to approach that from a woven
Well, you know
energy
why it's used?
perspective.
It's the kind of terminology that Messiah Eliade used in his famous book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. And it's not wrong. Shamans do use what you might call ecstatic trances. I'd prefer like non-ordinary states of consciousness as part of their techniques. But the purpose of shamanism is not to do ecstatic trance. That's not the purpose of shamanism. Ecstatic trance is one tool. Another tool is a drum. Another tool is using your voice like in Homiluk. Another tool is a staff. Another tool is a flute. Another tool is a mirror. Another tool is ecstatic trance. But it's no more important than any of those other tools. And my worry is that people reading articles like this will think that ecstatic trance is like what it's all about. And
Well, there's also
really,
something
really
alluring
isn't.
about that as well, isn't there? Like you
Yeah.
see those words and some people would be like, oh, that sounds interesting. I'd like
Yes.
to do that.
And the big thing that's missing from this article, I mean, for instance, the spiritual world and your higher self may be contacted through the inner senses in ecstatic trance. The imagination trap hasn't been mentioned anywhere. And probably, not casting any aspersions, but the people Sean's been talking to, corresponding with,
Or Googling,
have-
let's be
have-
fair. It's the metro.
have Titanic levels of imagination trap that's being carried around. That's my worry. And I see a lot of the stuff I see around contemporary stuff I see around shamanism, despite our best efforts over the last, I don't know, when did we start? Is it 10 years now? 9 years? We've been doing this?
2016 we started. So
Was it? Okay, so not that many yet.
I think 2016.
So- So anyway, however long we've been doing it, the imagination trap, I don't see it very many places. So for instance, myself and Graham reviewed a book recently by some people about was Jesus the ultimate shaman? I think that's what we called it. The imagination trap needs to be talked about in terms of shamanism. Because if it doesn't, all the imagination trap stuff and all the real shamanism stuff just gets mushed together, and it's hard to see the wood for the trees, especially for somebody who hasn't practiced very much, who hasn't practiced shamanism very much. It's very, very hard to see. And even if they have practiced shamanism a lot, even if what they think practicing shamanism involved is sitting around imagining things, then they might have been practicing for 20 years and still got nowhere, Shamanism is about, not that there's anything wrong with imagination, but shamanism is about the opposite of imagination. It's about getting rid of your imagination. It's about getting rid of your opinions, your beliefs, your prejudices, your ideas, your notions about the world, emptying yourself, and then, as we put it metaphorically, headbutting nature hard. That's what shamanism is really about. Let nature bang into you reality, truth, and don't bring your imagination into the picture. And this is the whole thing with the Grail. It's why it's so confusing, in the Arthurian legends, which are indeed shamanic in origin. The Holy Grail, as they call it. It's so basic, it's so foundational to shamanism. If you don't get that idea, and I don't just mean get it on the baseline, don't understand it intellectually. I mean, if you don't get it in your practice, in your physicality with physicality, in your spirituality with spirituality, and in your mind with the not thinking in an ecstatic trance, if you don't get that, there's no way you can go with shamanism because your cup isn't empty. When nature tries to fill it for you, your cup isn't empty. And there's nowhere to put the new Jikimotsu, as Miki would have called it. The real wisdom, the real knowledge that comes directly from nature And that real knowledge, that jikamatsu, is not anything that you make judgments about. It's not whether you like it or not. It's whether you don't like it or not. That's all irrelevant. If it comes to you from nature and it comes into an empty cup, then you can rely on it 100% because it didn't come from you and it didn't come from another human being and it didn't come from a book and it didn't come from culture and it didn't come from the education system. It didn't come from anywhere other than nature headbutting you in the face, a rock, a tree, a stream. It came from those places, a bird, tiger, whatever. It came to you from those places. Then you can rely on it 100%. The problem is our culture teaches us to rely on the other stuff more than we rely on that. And so the issue really is that without, and the number one thing for human beings, because we're weird animals, we are all weird, not just shamans. Sorry for all those who aren't shamans, but you're weird too. We are a weird kind of animal. The imagination thing in our brains went haywire because of this need to make complex tools. We need to be able to visualize stuff that exists in the future and doesn't exist yet, that is quite complicated. So we have to have this imagination ability, which has a legitimate application, which is like that. You know, hey, I want to build a computer, right? I need to be able to imagine this finished computer before I can actually build it. That's a complicated thing. I need that ability. I need that part of my brain not to be compartmentalized off as it is in other primates, for instance, chimpanzees, where they have that facility, but the visualization is a much more separate part of their brain. It's not all mushed in like it is in the human brain. I need to have that ability, but that ability in terms of shamanism fills my cup with junk. And the number one piece of junk it fills it with is imagination stuff. And so without chillicity, so what I'm saying is chillicity cannot be achieved. The first stage of becoming a shaman cannot be achieved without at least a minor recognition that the imagination trap exists in the world. Yeah. And what I see is an awful lot of information about shamanism that doesn't even mention it, despite how foundational that idea is to actual shamanic practice, to being a shaman in the real world. I don't see it mentioned anywhere, nor do I see it mentioned in this article.
Well, it's interesting because on a more serious note, articles like this don't particularly help because it's clear that, you know, what's Sean, is it called? Yeah, what Sean's doing is he's kind of like telling us what shamanism isn't, in a way, and kind of qualifying it at the end by talking about things that are clearly exploitative and attributing it to this idea of shamanism. Because, you know, it goes on to say, according to Earthheart Shamanism, a UK-based group, its methods mean the spiritual world and your higher self may be contacted through the inner senses in ecstatic trance. But then it describes shamans as the keepers of ancient techniques that are used to maintain energetic synergy and balance within themselves and communities, an increasing number returning to shamanism, blah, blah, blah. And then it says the Sacred Trust Centre, which runs a shamanism training facility in Dorset, offers instruction in exorcisms, days-long darkness immersion courses, and curse unraveling. And then it says a 1 year live-in course in shaman practices costs £2,500 pretty much, while converts are more pressed for time can learn its secrets via a 2-week, £2,800 intensive crash course. So he's found this obvious one sort of centre that are obviously, well, I'm not going to use the term for obvious reasons, but that clearly have what we would consider the wrong idea of what shamanism is. And he's using it to kind of paint this picture of shamanism in quite a negative way without actually saying it. Because a sensibly minded person would read that and go, really? You know, all these people are just delusional, that they're being separated from their money, going on this strange thing they call shamanism, where, you know, we're going on curse unraveling, whatever the hell that means. So, yeah. In my opinion, these articles, you know, they're fun to read, but they don't particularly help, do they? Especially when it goes down that kind of a route.
Yeah, again, that's all stuff we will address in some detail on heretics. I'm thinking this is probably going to be multiple heretics episodes, to be honest.
We'll do it. It'll be interesting. It'll be fascinating to go into.
No, we are going to do it. That's our plan. In fact, we're planning to record the first one tomorrow. So,
well, the one last thing to mention about this article, as far as I'm concerned here, we've got Shamanism is a loose collection of beliefs found in various communities around the world.
Yeah, that's
which
nonsense,
would evolve.
isn't
Oh,
it?
no, sorry. Hang on.
Yeah.
Where is it now? No, I think that's it. Shamanism is a loose collection of beliefs found in various communities, which revolves around. It says something about they evolved independently of each other.
They did evolve independent of each other.
It was a sentence. It was a paragraph which struck me as half true and half not.
I would say that shamanism is the opposite of belief.
Here we go. The word shaman derives from a Siberian language, but the beliefs it is used to describe vary wildly. So that isn't particularly true, because the beliefs, they're not beliefs. The techniques, shall we say, used to don't really vary wildly, as we've talked about ad nauseum and demonstrated ad nauseum on this podcast. But it says they've often evolved independently of each other around the planet. Well, that is true, but the same stuff has evolved independently around the planet.
Yeah, not different stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, but also another thing I would put in there, if I was writing the article, maybe I'll rewrite the article, I don't know, but if I was writing the article, I would make the point that this stuff evolved before we became human beings.
Yeah.
We were shamans long before we were humans.
Yeah, and it is just a word to describe something which was paramount to the survival of the human and animal species, right?
Yeah.
Because as we talked about again on this podcast, shamanism, quote unquote, isn't just a human thing. It's a dog thing. It's an animal thing. It's an eagle thing.
Certainly, at the very least, it's social animals thing. Yeah, at the very least. You could extend it out depending on how far you wanted to more sultry animals as well, have aspects of shamanism. So yeah, I think that one of the best ways to look at this is there is already within the miasma a strong sense of what shamanism is, which is it's not Sean's fault, is it? It's what he's picking up on.
Yeah.
And there's two things. One is we want to encourage people not to learn about shamanism. We never wanted that for this podcast. There are other podcasts for that. And books and things. We wanted to encourage people to become shamans, which involves doing things, which involves practice, which involves applying shamanic technique, achieving chelicity, and working towards taking on nature as your direct teacher without other human intervention, including books and things like that, without all aspects of culture, without that intervention. That's what we'd be encouraging people to work towards. If people do that, then all of this stuff is not really a problem. Yeah, It's only a problem when they don't. Because they will quickly, if they do that, they will quickly understand a lot more than both the people who wrote the article and the people who wrote the article talked to in order to get the content for it, or read about in order to get the content for it.
Well, let's hope they find our podcast, Damon. And all will be well.
All right. We don't do too bad on the sort of Google and all that kind of stuff, But the thing is, a lot of them might be horrified by our podcast. That's a whole other issue.
Yeah, listen to a few episodes and we go, actually, shamanism takes hard work.
As we know, exactly. As we know in marketing, it's always an easy, simple proposition is always a good one in marketing. And I'm afraid we definitely ain't been offering that, mate.
Well, I wait in bated breath to hear the Heretics
series,
spin on
probably.
This. It'll be series. It'll be absolutely fascinating.
Yeah.
I think you're going to really dive deep into the darker side of it. Is that right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
And the terms and all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Excellent. So as soon as those are done and those are available, we'll mention it here on this podcast as well. So you can go and listen to those. But I really hope you've enjoyed this one. Again, it's been a nice little inroad into our take on shamanism. And if you want to go read the article, as I said, I've linked it in the information box below, and hopefully you can read it with a new lens now. So thanks a lot for listening. Do we have any patrons to thank, Damon?
Oh, we do, mate. Sorry. That's a really well raised point.
Well, I'll tell you what. Should we do that in the next episode? Should we thank everyone in the next episode at the beginning of the episode? Or do you want to thank them now?
We could do a whole bunch in the next episode. I just wanted, there's one in particular that I wanted to thank. Got the notifications, sorry. So Ben Thurnhofer, I just wanted to thank him for the discussions we've been having this week, which has given us some ideas for the actual Christmas episode. So thanks, Ben.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much.
The Christmas episode. So he's one of our existing patrons anyway. Actually, he's actually upped his level of support for us. Thanks ever so much, Ben, for that as well. Also, Mayor, our awesome patron, long-standing patron now, has up the sort of subscription, I don't know what they call it, on Patreon. And we also got Daniel Mann, Sebastian Luttig, and these are, people who've either come to support us or existing patrons who are upping or renewing their support for us. We have such an amount of support of you guys. Our patrons are, as you guys know, many of our patrons are involved far beyond simply the support they use paying for our microphones and stuff. Long way beyond that stuff. So real big thanks to all our patrons. You guys are superstars. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. You can always support us at patreon.com/wovenenergy. You can contribute whatever you wish, and that will unlock various bits and pieces for you. So we'll say thank you very much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you in the next one.
All the best, guys.